Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now. Welcome to Then and Now. My name is Maia Ferdman. I'm a producer of Then and Now and assistant director at the Luskin Center for History and Policy. Our guest this week is Manisha Shah, professor of public policy and the newly appointed Franklin D. Gilliam Chair in Social Justice at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. She's also the director of the Global Lab for Research and Action. She's a development economist whose primary research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of applied microeconomics, health, and development. And she's written several papers on the economics of sex markets in order to learn how more effective policies and programs can be deployed to slow the spread of HIV, AIDS, and other STIs. Welcome, Manisha. Happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Maya.
So, prostitution or sex work is often referred to as the oldest profession. Despite the ubiquity of sex work across both time and geography, public understandings of and policy approaches to sex work and its associated impacts on health and safety have diverged drastically. One of the most stigmatized professions, we also can't ignore the influence of morality politics onto these different policy approaches. Manisha, you've conducted research globally and in the US, examining the effects of different policy approaches to sex work on public health and other outcomes. And so to fully understand this issue, it's helpful to look at the development of these different policy approaches over time. So let's jump right in. So it seems like the baseline approach to sex work, both generally and globally, has been complete prohibition until really very recently. So can we talk a little bit about prohibition? When did it become the default approach to sex work, or has it always been this way? And why? Why is that?
So great question, Maya. And honestly, I think the answer to your question really depends on how far back we want to go in time. For many hundreds of years in early human history, prostitution was actually just a regular part of life. And in fact, I think that's why we often call it the oldest profession. It's been around basically since we've been around. But then fast forward in time to the 1500s, and you have syphilis, which appears in Europe. And it's sort of, our first big sexually transmitted disease that, 1500s Europe, it's ravaging Europe. And then there becomes this association with syphilis and brothels and prostitution and morality, and all of these conversations start. And again, because of sort of history, it's not until the early 1900s when penicillin is discovered and we have this cure for syphilis. So we basically have this long period in human history where sex work and sexually transmitted infections really become kind of hand in hand and part of the conversation. And that's really where this issue of, how do we regulate this market? What kinds of laws do we implement? In the United States, in fact, there's never, as far as I know, been a federal law which prohibits prostitution in the US. All of the prohibition actually happens at the state level. And in fact, all states in the United States, except for a few counties in Nevada, which do allow regulated sex work, prohibit sex work. And so, in the US, as in many parts of the world, prohibition is really just the norm. I want to say a few things about this prohibition, though. So prohibition in the United States and in most places in the world happens on the supply side, meaning what we do is the way we sort of prohibit sex work is we go after the generally female suppliers of sex. And this is, again, historically speaking, this is how criminalization or prohibition of sex work has functioned. We arrest the women, we fine the women. I want to mention, though, that there is this newer model of prohibition today called the Nordic model or the end demand model that is attempting to go after the demand side, right? The male purchaser, the male clients of sex. And we can talk about this later. This model starts in Sweden in 1999, but it is kind of a newer form of prohibition where, historically speaking, prohibition has always been on the supply side of the market. The women are the ones who are getting jailed and arrested and fined. In a few countries today now, we're talking about prohibition as well on the demand side. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention other parts of the world where prohibition has not been the norm, right? Where we do allow for legal and regulated sex markets. Take, for example, Australia. Most parts of Australia have legal and regulated sex work. Take Latin America. Latin America is another really interesting case study where much of Latin America allows for legal and regulated sex work. The same goes for India. There's a few countries in Northern Europe, a few countries in Africa, where we do allow for legal and regulated sex work.
Okay.
So again, I would say kind of the norm is prohibition, but there are these few places in the world where we do have these thriving legal and regulated markets.
And I want to move to those examples in a moment and also talk about the Nordic example. But just to make sure I understand, it sounds like prohibition started when you said there's this association with syphilis because of a public health fear. And yet there was also this sort of policing maybe of the women who are the supply side most generally. Was this a public health, is prohibition a reaction to the public health implications of sex work? Is there, where does morality and, the US sort of religious orientation play into prohibition?
I think it's both. I think it's definitely motivated by these public health concerns, but really hand in hand with morality and Christianity and, this idea that in economics, we often call this term moral repugnance, right? It's this idea that there's a lot of people out there who don't think that we should be pricing sex, right? That sex is not something that should be sold on a market, and that there's this moral repugnance associated with this idea. And that very much comes, hand in hand with kind of our moral values, right? What type of morality do we want? What type of moral society do we want to live in? And I think there's just a lot of people out there who associate brothels and sex markets and selling sex with moral repugnance.
Can you tell us, when did researchers begin to better understand the negative impacts of prohibition? And what are those negative impacts?
Yeah, so, honestly, the kind of serious empirical research on sex markets is relatively new. I would say the evidence on the negative impacts of prohibition has really been mounting over the past, 10 to 20 years. And we have a great body of empirical evidence now. And basically, I think what all of the evidence suggests is that there are very negative impacts of prohibition. And I think this makes sense because we know that pushing anything underground just makes it more risky. And the sex market is not unique in that way, right? Because when we prohibit, what we're basically doing is we're pushing it underground. And there's basically a really large body of good empirical evidence now that shows that when we push these types of markets underground, we're increasing the spread of sexually transmitted infections, not just to, the women who participate in the markets and their male clients, but to society on a whole, right? Because of the way sexually transmitted infections function and they get transmitted to the greater population. There's a good body of evidence now showing that prohibition increases violence against women. It creates less trust with the police, and so that sex workers are much less likely to collaborate with police. Women, female sex workers feel a lot less empowered when there's prohibition in terms of doing things like enforcing condom use with clients or, thinking this client is risky. I don't want to, have sex with him. They feel a lot less empowered to reject clients. Take owners of massage parlors or owners of brothels. These folks are also going to be a lot less inclined to invest in the safety of their workers, right? If they know there's some positive probability that the police will come in and shut them down, they're not going to hire the security systems. They're not going to invest in their workers. And so there's all sorts of negative impacts associated with this prohibition.
You mentioned other examples of places where there have been regulated sex markets, which has been another major way of dealing with or another policy approach to dealing with them. How has regulation either been successful and unsuccessful in sort of mitigating those harms that you just named? And can you say a little bit about, in answering that, you did some research in Ecuador demonstrating how regulation affected STI infection rates of indoor versus outdoor sex workers differently. So can you sort of paint a picture for us of that, of how regulation functions in reaction to those harms, and then your
Absolutely. Yeah. So let me just start with the general overview of regulation. And that what I want to note is that this kind of legal and regulated market, it really depends on the country that you're in. And most countries, enact laws on how they want to regulate sex markets. But I think one of the norms that we see in these legal and regulated places is one of the ways this regulation functions is that sex workers are required to have some sort of occupational license. In Latin America and in Ecuador, where we worked, it's called a carnet. But basically, the way this licensing works is that you have to get regular health checkups, you have to get regular STI tests, you have to get regular HIV tests. It's very much, again, motivated by these underlying public health concerns. And so if we were to look at kind of the public health impacts in these legal and regulated places, I would say on average, this type of licensing functions in that sex workers who have these carnets tend to have better health outcomes. And I think that's been very positive. There has been work done in Senegal. So Senegal is another one of these countries with a, kind of thriving legal and regulated sex market, showing that while these licenses, again, have been successful in terms of improving health outcomes, they've probably been less successful in terms of like sex worker mental health. So for example, one of the things that happens is once you have this license, you're kind of publicly identified as a sex worker. We know that a lot of women do this type of work on the side, or, they don't want their families finding out. And so the sort of increase for stigma, right, from this type of system increases. And there's other work that also came out from Senegal showing, negative mental health outcomes of these types of licensing requirements as well. Again, because you have to come out and publicly acknowledge that this is what you're doing for a living. So in Ecuador, we wanted to do some research on this issue. We wanted to understand what the impacts of, requiring women to have these carnets looked like on various outcomes. I'm going to tell you a little about some of the public health outcomes, but in Ecuador, as in much of Latin America, selling sex is legal. And women are required to have these carnets, and they're required to have updated carnets. And every so often, what will happen is the police will come and do sweeps, right? And they'll ask women, hey, let me see your carnet. And if she doesn't have it, or it's expired, then she either has to pay a fine, or she's arrested, or, there's sort of some cost associated with it. And so what we did, we collected a nationally representative sex worker data set, which was quite a project in itself. And then we basically followed these women over time and studied this issue. One thing I want to mention about the carnet, though, is in Latin America and a lot of these African countries where this system exists, women, the sex workers themselves, are required to kind of bear the burden of these costs, right? In that they're paying for the STI test, they're paying for the HIV test, they're paying for the health checkups. Which is unlike places in Northern Europe who have the same system, but because they have these kind of nationalized healthcare systems, the sex workers are not actually bearing these costs out of pocket themselves. So what we've seen in a lot of lower income countries, in Ecuador, for example, is that you have this kind of regulated legal market hand in hand with this underground street market, which tends to be riskier, which is where women who don't have carnets or women who have expired carnets tend to work. And just as a little point of background for all of the listeners, there's a huge body of evidence showing that indoor sex work is just a lot safer than outdoor sex work, right? And ideal public policy is we want to get women indoors because on kind of every margin of risk, indoor is better than outdoor. And so what we basically find in this paper is that when there's more police sweeps on the street, this actually has a positive impact on, it decreases sexually transmitted infections. And the reason for this is because when you're increasing enforcement on the street, when there's more police sweeps happening on the street, what you're basically doing is you're shifting women indoors into the brothel sector. And that's kind of good for public health outcomes. But what we also find is when we increase these police sweeps indoors in these brothels, kind of all the women who have expired carnets or women who just don't have carnets who are working kind of underground in the brothel, what you're doing is you're pushing them out onto the street. And that has negative implications for public health, precisely because you're moving them into this kind of riskier street sector.
So it really depends on the nature of that regulation, how it shuffles the market, so to speak.
And who bears the cost of the regulation, right? Because in Latin America, women are bearing the cost of this regulation. And if we were to say, hey, we're going to give you all of this for free, I think there could be a lot more compliance.
That's helpful. And where are, in all of these conversations, and I'm curious to move on to the Nordic model in a moment, but before we do that, where are sex workers' voices in the regulation of sex work? Are they consulted? Are there activist movements? Are there, especially when you say that there's, that women or the sex workers themselves are bearing the burden in many countries of these costs, where have their voices been in all of this?
That's a great question, because I've done a lot of work with sex workers all over the globe and spent a lot of time with them. And in many countries, Ecuador, India, all over the world, they have these thriving unions and, lots of organization and lots of voice. But I will also tell you that historically, their voices have not been a part of the conversation when it comes to actual policy and actual regulation. They just, though they're very well organized in many countries, we often don't listen to what they have to say when it comes to how we should be regulating the market. I will say this is definitely changing now, and a few kind of movements come to mind. There's a lot of sex workers organizing right now in New York City, in Rhode Island, really pushing for decriminalization. And it's been really exciting to see that this is happening. But I think it's still very much an open question about how much we are going to listen to their voices when we're actually enacting policy. Because in terms of kind of policy making, I would say that their voices have been largely absent, or their opinions on how we should be regulating the market have been largely absent.
Which seems, like a clear issue, considering how regulation, which is meant to, be in the interest of public health, ends up having detrimental health outcomes. And if you were to ask the people involved and the people who these policies are meant to protect, so to speak, they may tell you otherwise, So that's helpful. And I think it's informative to what happened in 1999. You mentioned it, when Sweden prompted this new approach to the regulation of sex work. Instead of criminalizing the sex workers, often women, Sweden would now make the purchase of sex illegal, essentially shifting the burden. And it also would fund these exit services to help sex workers wishing to leave the industry. So this effectively treats the sex worker as the victim of a crime and the client or the purchaser as the perpetrator of the crime. So can you share a little bit more about what's behind Sweden's, and then later Norway, France, Canada, and some other countries shift to this model? Is this also about public health? Is this about protecting women? Is this about morality? What's behind this?
Great question. Lots to unpack there. And so I think you're exactly right in that the model starts with this idea that all sex work is exploitative, that sex workers and women are victims of this sort of patriarchal system where men are, buying sex from them. And the main idea behind this model is we're going to criminalize the demand side, right? We're going to arrest men, fine men, so we can shut down the demand side so that women can basically exit this very exploitative industry. What's been also very interesting from a public policy perspective is how quickly this model is getting adopted outside of Nordic countries. It started in Sweden, but now you have Canada, France, Israel, Northern Ireland. All of these countries are adopting this policy. I sort of often jokingly call this the 21st century, regulatory policy of choice. And I say jokingly because I'm not sure why. We have, historically since 1999, we've had very little empirical evidence on the impact of this policy, yet you have all these countries adopting this policy. I would say that today we do know a little more about the Nordic model because, it's been about 20 years since it was first implemented. And I can say a little about the empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence for this model is not great, right? And so take point number one of the model, which is kind of to protect women and shut down the demand side of the market. So there's a recent study that just came out of the United Kingdom looking at whether or not this happens, right? So they follow, individuals over time in the UK and basically find that actually demand does not decrease when we implement this type of model. So demand is not decreasing, but here's what's happening that is very interesting. The composition of the demand is shifting. And so now the males who are buying sex are actually riskier clients than the males who used to buy sex. So again, from a public policy perspective, that's not where we want to be going. You don't want more risky men entering this market. You obviously as clients, you would tend to prefer kind of the average safe man and not this kind of compositional shift towards more risk.
Because they're more willing to take the risk despite the criminality of the act. They're still okay with doing this.
Exactly. You got it. Exactly. And then the other area, there's been other work looking at the impacts of the Nordic model on violence against women. And I just want to note like two very interesting studies that have come out here. So one paper looks at data in Sweden, and they look at kind of reported rape offenses over time since the Nordic model goes into place. And they find increases in rape offenses against women. And this is not just sex workers, this is all women. There's also a new paper looking at a similar question in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland has also implemented this policy, and they're finding similar increases in violence against women. So again, kind of not great conclusions in terms of violence. And then I think the other interesting thing the Swedish study finds is that once Sweden enacts these laws, you see this increase in sex tourism, where men are now more likely to fly to Thailand because guess what? It's become more costly for them to buy sex in their own country. And so you have this kind of displaced demand happening to lower income countries. And so again, like from a public policy perspective, it's not clear to me that these are the types of impacts, right, we want from new policies. And so, generally speaking, my sense of the empirical evidence coming out on this model is that it's a model we need to be worried about. And I worry that all of these countries are kind of implementing this model because it sounds good, right? We want to protect our women, men shouldn't be buying sex. And going back to this kind of morality issue, I think this messaging does really well with people's ideas of morality.
Well, there's like a paternalism, there's sort of a paternalism sort of undergirding that.
Exactly.
We want to protect our women. It's really those bad men who are buying sex that we should criminalize. And but in that paternalism, you get actually more violence, as you just outlined. So it's sort of a counterintuitive policy outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, that's really useful to, especially considering, that these are put in place with this stated desire to protect public health and to protect against the spread of STIs and the like, and support, protect against violence against women. And up until now, we've focused on three policy approaches to sex work: total prohibition, regulation, and then the Nordic model, or the criminalization of clients, which from my understanding, makes up the majority of policy approaches to sex markets around the world, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
So much of your research in the last decade has really focused on the public health impacts of full decriminalization. So one stark example comes from your research in Rhode Island, where a 2003 court case uncovered that a 1980 ruling had effectively and unintentionally decriminalized sex work in Rhode Island. So can you tell us a little more about that study, and what were some of your findings about what happened between 2003 and 2009, when they realized what had happened and sex work was criminalized once again? What happened in those few years of decriminalization?
Yes, I'd love to tell you about that. That was such a fun paper to write, I have to say. And again, just for your listeners, what decriminalization is it's the removal of criminal penalties for engaging in sex work. But there's no kind of regulation, so there's sort of criminalization and legal and regulated. And I would put decrim in the middle of that, which is often, in places that have criminalized, like the US, one place for the US to move toward would be decrim, which is like, hey, we're just going to get rid of all the criminal penalties associated with engaging in sex work. And then maybe later down the road, we want to think about how we might regulate this market. So just to kind of set you up there. And what happens in Rhode Island, again, historically in the US, and in much of the world, sex markets really happened on the streets, right? People sold sex on the streets. And then over time, with the advent of the internet and brothels, and you've had this entire sex market moving indoors slowly, where in the United States now we think kind of 80% of the sex market is actually an indoor market, and there's very little sex being sold on the streets. But back in the day when we were writing laws, a lot of the laws against prostitution or sex work had to do with loitering and street sex work, and because that's where the market was. And so in Rhode Island, a lot of massage parlor workers were just constantly being kind of arrested and harassed by police. And, there's a big sting in the massage parlors. And what happens is a lawyer, Michael Kaselica, who actually knows the case laws, tells these massage parlor workers, hey, let's take this to court, because if you read the law is actually about loitering and outdoor street sex work. And you guys, you were all indoors in these massage parlors. So they take it to court, they win their case. And so from 2003 to 2006, there's this period in Rhode Island where police can't go after indoor sex workers because, this judge has basically ruled that these women were not doing anything wrong. And so what's exciting about this for us from kind of a research perspective, one of the reasons that it's so hard to do causal impact analysis of kind of policy is that when a policy around sex work changes, it often changes for the entire country, right? So take New Zealand. In 2003, New Zealand decriminalized. But if I want to study the impact of that decriminalization, it's hard to think about what a good control group for New Zealand is, right? Like, what's the counterfactual for New Zealand? Hard to think about. Whereas in the US, we have this nice natural experiment where Rhode Island changes its laws around sex work, but none of the other states do. And so we can either use like the other states in New England as a control group, or we can use the rest of the United States as a control group. And so we have this real nice policy experiment where we can do some causal analysis. And so we look at 4 outcomes that we are most interested in. I mean, the first thing we wanted to look at is like, hey, we know this judge makes this ruling in 2003, but does that mean that police actually stop arresting sex workers? And so we look at, we get uniform crime reports data from the FBI, and we look at what's happening in Rhode Island. And yes, we do find a significant decrease in arrests for prostitution during this period. The next thing we're interested in is what happens to the size of the market. A lot of people worry that when you decriminalize, the size of the market will expand, right? And what will that mean for public health and violence and all these things that we care about? And so what we do is we say, hey, let's look at the size of the market by looking at, is there growth in massage parlors? Yes, there is. So we do see more massage parlors. Are there new entrants into this market? Yes. We see a lot more online advertising and newspaper advertising. And so, yes, the sex market does grow during these 6 years in Rhode Island. And then, of course, we're interested, in public health outcomes. So we look at gonorrhea incidents, and we're interested in violence against women. So we look at reported rape offenses. So here I want to mention that the theoretical effect of decriminalization, right? If we were just to think about this from a theoretical perspective, the impact of decrim is ambiguous. Why is it ambiguous on public health outcomes? Well, we've shown that the size of the market has grown, right? And so if we think that like disease is just going to be an increasing function of the size of the market, right? People are having more sex, there's going to be more disease, then we would expect increased STIs. But if we think that there might be some changes due to decriminalization, right? So we're decriminalizing, maybe women now feel more empowered to enforce condom abuse. Maybe, we have all these new entrants to the market. I've just told you, right, that massage parlors grow, more advertising happens. Maybe these new entrants are safer, right? And maybe they're more likely to use condoms. They're less likely to have disease. So this, again, can really change the sexual network. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. So even though the sex market grows during this period of 6 years, there's a significant decrease in gonorrhea incidence. And this is not just for the sex workers, it's for all women in the state, right? Because of the kind of nature of disease transmission and all the externalities associated with it. So we find about a 45% decrease in gonorrhea incidence during this period, which is amazing because that's a pretty significant decrease. The other outcome that we were interested is, reported rape offenses. And so what happens to violence against women during this period? And again, the results are exciting because, again, even though the sex market is growing, reported rape offenses during this period in Rhode Island relative to the rest of the United States decreased by about 30%. And so this is very consistent with some of the other literature in terms of this idea that when you decriminalize, you're making the work environment safer. And it has all of these sort of positive externalities, not only for the women engaged in sex markets, but for the wider society at large.
So you have, just to summarize back, a decrease in arrests, an increase in the size of the market, and particularly in massage parlors, but then a significant decrease in the spread of gonorrhea, even amongst the general population, and a decrease of 30% in rape offenses, decrease in violence against women, and decrease in sexually transmitted diseases, despite the increase in the size of the market.
Exactly.
How do those findings of decriminalization compare to your recent findings in East Java in Indonesia about the health consequences of criminalization, since you recently did that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right after we finished the Rhode Island study, I was doing some work in Indonesia with some other collaborators. And in fact, we were working in 3 districts in East Java, Indonesia, precisely because this area has a long history of a thriving domestic sex sector. And so we were actually going to be implementing a randomized controlled trial with these women around a savings experiment to get them access to mobile savings. And while we're doing all of this work, the mayor in one of the 3 districts that we're working in announces that, as a birthday present to the district, he is going to shut down all of their indoor brothels. And, he announces this in July 2014 with the idea that by November 2014, so very quickly, he's just going to shut down all of these brothels. And so the NGO that we were working with on, to do the savings experiment basically tells us, hey, sorry, we can no longer collaborate with you on this project because we can't be breaking the law by working with these women in these brothels. And so this was very much one of these examples of research where you kind of turn lemons into lemonade because we pivoted and we said, hey, we've already collected data on all of the sex workers in these 3 districts. Let's just use this funding now to follow them over time and see what happens when in one district, all of the brothels sort of shut down officially and basically become criminalized. And so what's interesting about this is like the exact opposite policy experiment of what happens in Rhode Island, in that, here we're in this world of kind of legal, thriving sex industry. And then in one district, the mayor's like, we're shutting you guys all down. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was, his idea was, like, we're going to shut you down, and then we're going to transition these sites to like karaoke bars and markets and do all this exciting stuff. But of course, there's absolutely like no budget allocated to any of this work. And so what happens in practice is these brothels just become like underground brothels where, they're no longer collaborating with like the local Ministry of Health. They're no longer collaborating with NGOs, all the sort of, free condoms and health services and all of the things that you see, these were very organized, beautifully run brothels. It all kind of shuts down. And then you just sort of see this like quiet sex industry happening in these places. And so, what do we do? Let me just, we were kind of interested in various outcomes. I think one of the things we were really interested, though, is what happens to the size of the market, right? Because like we talked about with the end demand model, there's always this idea that when you criminalize, you're going to shut down the market, right? And that's going to have all these amazing public health implications and blah, blah, blah. So we said, let's follow this market over time. We've already done this census pre-criminalization. So we go back 1 year later, and then we go back 5 years later, and we basically just do a census of the total number of sex workers in these 3 districts. And I think, just this finding is super interesting. Like when we go back 8 months right after they've announced criminalization, the number of sex workers in these criminalized brothels has obviously decreased, right? And so, yes, the market has gotten smaller. But when we go back 5 years later, the size of the sex market is exactly the same size as the market when we first started this study 5 years ago. And so it's rebounded, everything's back to normal, but these women are now in different places. They've sort of shifted to different sectors. Some of them are working on the street. And so what you've basically done is you've taken these organized brothels that were working with like the local Ministry of Health, for example, and you've shifted these women now into other locations, some of them probably riskier locations. And so, again, like I always say this, there's a reason we call this the oldest profession in the world, and criminalizing is just not going to shut it down. And in fact, this is what we show 5 years later, that didn't happen. The other outcomes, we were interested in, it was we of course, we tested all of these women for sexually transmitted infections. And we, again, for the women working in these criminalized sites, we find huge increases in sexually transmitted infections post criminalization of around, I want to say it's around 57% increase in STIs. Wow. So, kind of obviously negative public health implications. And then the other thing I was very interested in is, because we were collecting data on these women themselves, one thing we often forget is that a lot of sex workers are mothers. In fact, in low-income countries, 90% of women who participate in sex markets have children. And many of these women are doing this work precisely because they need to support their children. And so we actually collected data on these women related to happiness and income and their children's welfare, because we were interested to understand like how criminalization also impacts their households, right? Because these women are mothers, they have children. And, and again, the results were sort of what you would expect. Like these women who work in these criminalized brothels, their income decreases significantly post-criminalization. And what you see happening is they're forced, some of them are pulling their children out of school and reporting that now their children have to help supplement their household income by working. And so, there's all these kind of downstream effects that we also don't think about when we criminalize these markets, and that often these women are supporting households of like children and parents and other folks, and like what all the negative implications are on all of those other individuals as well.
It's pretty stark when you place those two studies in relation to each other, those two, unexpected research studies, and the almost directly opposing outcomes that you found, despite, of course, the different geographies, the different cultural contexts, the different governments. It's pretty stark. Before we move into conclusion, I want to throw in one more variable and ask you about it, about human trafficking, which often is a catch-all term for sex trafficking and labor trafficking and other forms of what people have called the white slave trade back in the day, back in the early 20th century. And now it has taken many forms. So LA is often considered a global hub for human trafficking, including sex trafficking. In 2018, the LA County Homeless Count actually found that 1 in 10 individuals experiencing homelessness reported having been either sex or labor trafficked. How do we move between the fight against sex trafficking and the decriminalization of sex work? What's the relationship between these issues, which are often placed into conversation with each other in policy spheres?
So this is a big, big concern among some circles. And, just to recap what you said, which is this idea that decriminalization of sex work will lead to an increase in sex trafficking. And this is something that you hear a lot. You hear it a lot in the media. And it is a concern, I don't want to take this lightly, but I also want to state that we now do have empirical evidence, and my sense of the data is that this hasn't played out in the data. So, I briefly touched on New Zealand. New Zealand was one of these few countries that has fully decriminalized. If you look at what's happened in New Zealand, you've seen no increase in sex trafficking there. Like, I haven't seen any studies suggesting that to be the case. There was, while we did a quantitative study on the work in Rhode Island, there was also qualitative work done in Rhode Island in these massage parlors. And my understanding is, again, from interviews with the massage parlor workers there, they claimed like during the 6-year period of decrim that they didn't observe any increases in, in sex trafficking. And so while this seems to be an issue that people spend a lot of time worrying about, it's not clear to me that, again, that empirically this relationship plays out, right? That if we end up in this world where we've decriminalized sex work, that we will see this increase in sex trafficking and human trafficking. And I think, honestly, one of my concerns is the conflation of the two, right? Is that we're often, for a lot of people, they're one and the same, right? For a lot of people, sex work and sex trafficking are the same thing. For many feminists in the US, they will say like all sex work is sex trafficking. And I think that's an unfair conflation, because I would say the majority of women who engage in sex work are doing this, as a job to make a living. And we could talk further about this, but all this to say that it's definitely people are concerned about it, but my sense, at least of the findings and the data, is that it's not something that sort of played out in the data as far as I know.
Thank you. It seems like we could dedicate an entire other episode to the history of sex trafficking and legal approaches to that issue. But alas, we're running out of time. So it seems, though, if we look at all of the evidence that decriminalization ultimately benefits public health, it benefits safety and violent, reduces violence and leads to other positive outcomes. And yet the U.S. is almost entirely, as you mentioned, still prohibiting sex work completely, with the exception of some counties in Nevada. Just this year, the California legislature passed SB 357, which repealed a provision of a law that criminalizes loitering with the intent to engage in prostitution. So before this law, it was criminal to basically stand in the street and look like you were going to engage in sex work. And activists, speaking of the voices of sex workers, argued that this law led to the consistent profiling primarily of transgender women and trans women of color who were profiled for standing in the street, essentially. And it also discouraged sex workers from carrying condoms because condoms could be used as evidence that they were loitering with the intent to engage in sex work. So sex workers would avoid carrying condoms for fear of police harassment. All that is to say, that this provision was just repealed in California. So this is a political reality that even in the progressive state of California seems really far away from decriminalization and any form of legalization or regulation. So can you give us a sense, how realistic is decriminalization of sex work, both in the US and in other countries?
So I'm going to err on the optimistic side right now and say the timing for decriminalization is perfect right now. Why is it perfect right now? We're in the midst of a lot of tough conversations right now about the US criminal justice system. And you're exactly right. If I were to look at sex worker arrest data in the United States right now, what would I find? I would find that it's primarily Black and brown women, primarily low-income women who are getting arrested, who are getting fined. I also want to say, I personally think there are a lot of district attorneys across the country right now who understand this and do want to see change and, do want to spend their law enforcement resources doing something else. I think they're concerned about political blowback, right? Because precisely going back to these kind of like moral issues of, hey, once we start saying it's, okay to engage in sex work, what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. But we now have an arsenal of evidence, right? We now have an arsenal of really good empirical evidence showing that decriminalization is probably what we should be moving towards in this state and in other states across the US. So I'm hopeful. But I will also say another thing, which is, we've talked about the end demand and Nordic model in the context of other countries. There is a strong push for the end demand and Nordic model in the United States as well. It's very well funded. It's very well organized, and they're fighting for that as our policy change, right? This kind of moving from criminalizing women to criminalizing men. I mentioned that sex workers in New York are organizing for decrim, but there's also a lot of folks organizing for end demand. And so again, I think the timing is ripe to be getting all of this information out there. The evidence needs to get into the hands of policymakers. And I am hopeful that we can have some evidence-based policy that's made as opposed to kind of morality-based policy.
Well, on that note, one final question before we close. What can we learn from the history of policy approaches to sex work? And can you say a little more about what is your hope for the future?
I think my hope for the future and what we can learn is that the way we've been making policy for sex workers has not been based around evidence, but has been based much more around like moral preferences of society. And maybe that was fine in a world where we didn't have the evidence. But we now do have evidence, and we have mounting evidence. And so, in some sense, we should be making these policies based on the evidence we have. And at least for the United States, I think the next move for us, again, based on the evidence, should be decriminalization. We can think further down the road, like what that means. And, do we want to regulate the market, et cetera? And, that's a whole nother conversation. But I think at least as a first step, that's my read of the current evidence.
Well, Professor Manisha Shah, thank you so much for joining us on Then and Now. We are deeply appreciative of your time, and we hope to have you back sometime soon.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And thanks to our listeners out there. Have a good and safe day. Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maia Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.